According to universityaffairs.ca, it was in 1997 that Suzanne Simard published her findings in the prestigious journal Nature. Her article, The Wood Wide Web, created a stir and generated enthusiasm among scientists and naturalists alike, though her work was described as a dog's breakfast by some others. According to Dr. Suzanne Simard, a few well-established researchers did everything in their power to trash my work. As a young researcher, you can get hurt easily by that sort of thing. It slowed down my science. When your work is regarded as controversial, it's harder to get grants, harder to find funding, harder to get money for talks. At one point, I was ready to give it all up. Now, I've been working and researching and studying among scientists and academics for many years, and I have personal experience with just how vicious and biased some of their commentary can be. But from my experience studying in nature and advocating for conservation, I am quite certain some of the worst blowback Dr. Simard must have experienced must have been from those scientists, if we can call them scientists, working for the forestry industry. Dr. Simard's findings simply would not do. It implied that forests were deep and complex superorganisms. It implied a kind of adaptive, thoughtful intelligence. It certainly indicated that forests could not simply be wantonly cut down and left to grow back, which is a myth the forestry industry had been seeking to propagate among the general populace literally for generations, and the industry's survival depended upon continuing to propagate that myth. But the sins of the forestry industry are not our focus today. Rather, our focus is the wonders of the Wood Wide Web. My own field is psychology, a field I entered many years ago for complex reasons, but which ultimately related to wanting to understand the intelligence behind nature. In particular, how organisms can come together to create a new, higher intelligence, an emergent intelligence, a superorganism that is intelligent like a forest. It had been observed among scientists in the past that forests act so adaptively and cohesively to maintain the health of their environment, treating the air like lungs, the water like a circulatory system, and the earth like bones, that it would be more appropriate to think of a forest as a superorganism, presenting its own highly adaptive intelligence. Of course, much of the mystery with this hypothesis is, if the forest is a superorganism, how do its various components communicate and network? After all, it is the ability to network and create intercommunication that allows we humans to be intelligent. Our brains are comprised of tens of billions of neurons, each with what you might think of as tendrils extending from it, creating connections to the other neurons all around it. And there are more connections in a single human brain than there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy. And there are hundreds of billions of stars in the Milky Way galaxy. And each of those neurons by themselves has only the intelligence of a cell, which is to say that it has what you might think of as a memory that's good for a few seconds, enough for the cell to do what it has to do to survive. But nothing, literally nothing, in the way of what we might think of as higher intelligence. That's right, brain cells are not intelligent, at least not by themselves. They do not begin to exhibit higher intelligence until they are networked. But put 100 billion neurons together and network them with hundreds of billions more synaptic connections and allow them to communicate via electrical and chemical pathways. And something amazing happens, something so amazing. If there is magic in this universe, one might call it this. All that complexity comes together and sparks a living, breathing, thinking, self-aware entity, true and deep intelligence. And the discovery by Suzanne Simard of the Wood Wide Web may just be the key to understanding how a forest networks to act so cohesively and intelligently as an adaptive and capable superorganism which can both survive in, moderate, and change its own environment. Ever since I came across Suzanne Simard's work, her original paper, The Wood Wide Web, I've been utterly fascinated by its implications. Imagine something as ubiquitous as fungi, something people tend to think of either as a poison, a food, or a nuisance, might be, in its own very special way, the equivalent of the synaptic connections of a forest. I'll have to leave the biochemical analyses of the activities of fungi in the soil to those scientists with the resources and the equipment to study them. As a person with a decade of educational background in psychology, I'm much more interested in what those connections mean and what that intelligence might look like. Speaking of what it looks like, I've also been enraptured with the idea of capturing actual visuals of the networking of fungi between the trees. And this is no easy task. It's not like you can just take a camera and take a picture of mushrooms growing over the ground or sticking out of the wood on the sides of trees, because those are not the actual fungi. Rather, they are the fungi's fruiting bodies. To think of a mushroom or a bracket sticking out the side of a tree as a fungus is kind of like looking at an apple and thinking you are looking at the tree. But it is a lot easier to take a picture of a mushroom or a bracket, or a tree for that matter, than it is to take any imagery of the fungi that actually network trees. This is because they exist in the soil, in the region of Earth called the rhizosphere, up near the top of the soil and down among the tree's roots. And thus, they are surrounded entirely by opaque dirt. And these fungi don't look like an organism in the way that people think of organisms. They don't look like they have meaningful bodies, like the trunk of a tree or the torso of an animal. Rather, the fungi that live underground look more like microscopic, invisible threads, much smaller than a human hair. So small, in fact, that those threads are invisible to the human eye. To get imagery of them, I'm going to have to devise some way to wash away the dirt without destroying the fungal networks. I could certainly remove the dirt using acids and alkalis, but that would kill the fungal cells. And I'd rather photodocument them alive, where they can be observed in the course of conducting their natural behavior. Also, these networks grow in 3 dimensions, and in those cases where I have been able to remove the dirt from around the hyphae, that is, the organic threads that form a fungus body, the 3-dimensional network just collapses into something looking like a mass. But even if I could keep it 3-dimensional, it would still be very hard to capture imagery of, because microscopes are necessary to see hyphae. Light microscopes in particular that have lenses into which a camera can be attached. But such microscopes have razor-thin depths of field. That's the region where an image actually comes into focus. So only a very tiny portion of a subterranean fungal network can be brought into focus. Quality images can be taken of these networks, even with microscopes, through a technique called focus stacking. But it is a long, complicated process. But those are the current directions my research and photographic efforts are taking me. And I've had some successes, which I'm going to show you here. These microscopic structures are the fungal threads that create the Wood Wide Web. They're not hard to find, and here is where I found them, in the heart of an old forest. In this region of forest, there are old-growth hemlocks, surrounded by a mix of mature and young deciduous trees such as birches, maples, beeches, and small shrubby trees such as beaked hazelnut. And at the basis everywhere are mosses, bryophytes. Simple, primitive plants that do not have complex structure. I dug down beneath the bryophytes until I reached roots, and there took a few cuttings. This is a few millimeters of cutting portrayed under a stereo microscope, and I've zoomed in to about 10 power, well below its maximum. What looks like white dust all over the roots are places where threads of fungi are penetrating the root, and the white mass center right was a node where a large amount of fungal mass was penetrating the root. I don't know why there was so much fungal mass there, but it had certainly concentrated till I broke it away when I cut away the root for sampling. And this is another bit of root from about a meter away from, I believe, the same tree, but there were so many roots in the area I could not be sure. But you can see that it too is covered with a dusting where fungal threads are penetrating the root. These fungal threads are benefiting the tree. They are not there to parasitize it or hurt it. At the very least, they give the tree antimicrobials and keep it well supplied with micronutrients, and in return, the tree gives the fungus sugars to use for food. Fungi, not having chloroplasts, cannot produce food for themselves. But in this mutually beneficial relationship, both the tree and the fungi benefit. Here I've taken a shaving from the root. The shaving is only about 1 centimeter long, and it is still being magnified with overhead illumination under the stereo microscope at about 45 power. And here we can see another fungal mass. It looks like webbing laid over the root, but this is actually fungi partnering with the root. Its threads actually penetrate the root to directly supply the root with nutrients and receive the tree's exchange of sugars. Now we're going to combine the power of modern microscopy with that of modern computers, photography, and photo processing apps. Here I've taken a series of 8 photos with the focus at different depths, and I've run them through a photo stacker in an application called Affinity Photo. These photos were taken with a stereo microscope, which as microscopes go has a pretty good depth of field, but it took 8 photos to bring most of the relevant parts of the image into focus. It was worth it though, because here we can clearly see a mass of mycelia, the fungal threads, surrounding the bit of root, and the fungal threads growing all over the root, penetrating it at many different places. I obtained this image portraying the mass of mycelia in 3-dimensional form by very slowly and gently washing away the sand and humus-rich forest soil from around the root. To me, this is like watching man walk on the moon for the first time, and I wish you could see the 3-dimensional perspective that the stereo microscope provides. Even though as microscopes go, the magnification is quite low. 45 power is enough to clearly make out the fungal threads connecting and forming a symbiotic relationship with the tree root. And if Suzanne Simard is right, and the networking of the trees through the mycelia leads to a kind of intelligence, this is where it happens. This is the synaptic connection that brings trees together, all the trees of a forest like the neurons of a brain, to form an intelligent superorganism. Let's go yet deeper. This is a sample of the forest soil that I collected very carefully by digging it out with a spatula and transferring it directly into a Petri dish, being very careful to disturb the soil overall as little as possible so that the fungal structures would remain intact. At first glance, it might just look like random forest soil, but if you look closer at it, you'll see that fungal threads are woven everywhere throughout this image. And the duff and humus and soil of any healthy forest is like this, fungi everywhere. It holds the soil together and protects it from erosion. It penetrates and mines the soil for nutrients, which it then shares with the trees and plants. It means that the dirt beneath your feet is not just dirt. It is alive. It is breathing. And quite possibly, it is thinking. Not like humans think, to be sure, but thinking nonetheless. The fungi down in the rhizosphere, that is, living, breathing, metabolizing, and interacting, not only with the roots of trees, but with 99% of the plants on Earth, form amazing and complex structures as they weave their way through the ground. And though the individual strands are so small, as much as 10 times thinner than human hair, all put together they can be among the most massive organisms on Earth, covering acres and weighing hundreds of tons. One of the easiest ways to illustrate the complexity of their structures is simply to cultivate them in a Petri dish. I did this recently simply by taking some mold I found growing on a fruit, slicing off a bit of the fruit and putting it in the Petri dish with some water and waiting a few days. Water is not a solid medium, but by day 3 the fungi had interpenetrated the water which had soaked up the fruit's sugars, and through some catalytic effect that I do not yet understand, they had transformed that water into a jelly-like substance, and were growing through it in ways that very much reminded me of the ways I see them grow through the soil. It is wondrous and incredibly beautiful. Here I've put the fungi under a compound microscope and magnified it 400 times. And at this level of magnification you can clearly see the hyphae, even though they are 10 times thinner than human hair, and utterly invisible to the naked eye. They are not bioluminescent, though the way they virtually glow with the backlight through the bluish solution, they would seem to give that impression. The small round growing ovals between them are spores. The hyphae themselves are growing through the gelatinous material that they have transformed the juices from the orange slice and the water into. It is quite viscous, and as I said before, while it's not soil, in many ways this growth pattern appears to imitate the growth of hyphae through soil. They mine their way through it, seeking resources, creating strands of filament behind them, like a fairy city. And in the imagery above, you can see the varied stories or layers of it. Lowest right is closest to the camera. Middle upper right is the next depth down, a measure of only a few microns. And as the eye moves up and further to the right, the layers of hyphae continue to descend deeper and deeper into what is to them a sugary ocean. Transforming the light changes our perspective almost entirely. Here I've removed the blue, which allows other colors of the hyphae to stand out. They are complex and beautiful. Here we have backed out to a mere 100 magnification, and I've removed all colorization and instead blocked the direct light with a dark field filter. Working with the light in this way, we are thus able to emphasize the contrast, revealing the beautiful, delicate, crystalline structure of the fungal threads. They are masked on the edge of the rind and extending slowly into the fruit juice solution as if they are mining it, which is very similar to how they work their way and why they work their way into the soil surrounding the roots of trees and plants. What you are seeing is not only the way that fungi mine water and soil and weave themselves between and connect themselves to the tissues of plants, serving perhaps in the role of the dendrites of neurons, connecting all the plants, especially the trees, so that they can communicate with one another. But you are seeing them in their true form, the way they appear in soil and other media, when the delicate hyphal structures have not been disturbed and destroyed. And ultimately, whether you forage mushrooms or just appreciate them for their beauty, these delicate and generally invisible threads are their true body. If the mushroom grows in the soil, these hyphae will weave for many meters all around that mushroom. And if the mushroom grows on a tree, such hyphae will grow all up and down the tree, in its rotting and dying wood, and within its bark. And while some of these fungi are pathogenic toward plants, parasitizing them and potentially killing them, many, if not most of the fungi, are symbiotic and beneficial to plants. Indeed, most plants would, at a minimum, languish without them, and many would die. These strange organisms, little more than invisible threads in soil and in dying wood and decaying plants, so often invisible unless they form fruit large enough for us to see, are hugely important and will be a subject of future episodes of Understory. Thank you for coming along on this voyage of discovery into the Understory. The purpose of the Understory Channel is to tell the tales of the lives and the science that shape the natural world. If you appreciate the work of the channel, please take a moment to like and subscribe. And feel free to hop on over to Facebook and join the Understory group, where you can find links to fascinating articles and take part in discussions relevant to natural science. And finally, thanks to the many contributors who make this channel possible.